How's everybody doing? Today we are starting a new unit on ecology. So, without any further ado, let's begin. The key is, today we're just going to be looking at the two different components that exist in the environment. And those are the abiotic and the biotic components, and we're going to be looking at how they influence each other. Starting off, before we begin, we need to understand that there are different levels of the environment that we can be looking at. And they start at the biosphere, biome, ecosystem, community, population, down to the organism. So the smallest level that we're going to look at is organism, and the largest that we could look at is the biosphere. When we separate out these different groupings, we see that the top three combine both the abiotic and the biotic components. They are both the living and the non-living components. And the bottom three contain only the biotic components. So a little bit of vocab to get us going in our unit on ecology. First thing is biosphere. We're just going to work our way through all the different levels. The biosphere, very simply, is the Earth. It is the living environment that we have on this planet. Next, we have a biome, and it's a group of ecosystems that share similar climates and typical organisms. In a little bit, we're going to be looking at what climate really is, but hold off for a second on that. Next is the ecosystem. That's all of the organisms that exist in a place together with their non-living environment. So now we have the biosphere, the biome, and the ecosystem. And these both contain abiotic and biotic components. On the other hand, the next set, they are only going to use the biotic components. They're only going to be composed of biotic components. The first of which is a community. So a community, that happens to be the assemblage or a grouping, I just use that word just because I like it, okay, of organisms that happen to be in a specific place. Next, you have a population. That's a grouping of organisms all of the same species. And lastly, you have the specific organism, the living entity, all on its own. But when we look at specific components, the first components that we're going to have to look at, before we get to the living components that these are made up of, the biotic components, we are going to look at the non-living components, the abiotic components. So the first abiotic component that we should look at is the energy that is available in a given area. That's the first abiotic component. It all comes from the sun. That's where all the energy on this planet derives from. So all the energy on this planet is derived from the sun, and it starts off when it gets converted by our producers. So in our environment, in our ecosystem, the first thing that happens is the producers are going to take the energy from the sun and they are going to convert that into chemical energy using photosynthesis, which we've gone over way back a while ago. So hopefully you remember that whole process that is involved in taking the energy from the sun and converting it into chemical energy. It travels then through a food chain as different organisms consume other organisms. And just to be sure, we need to remember energy, it cannot be created or destroyed. So the energy that we are getting from the sun, that's not made here. That's not also, nor is it made by the sun. The sun is just releasing that energy and then it gets converted. And in that conversion, some energy is going to be lost as an unusable form of energy or an energy type that is not needed or necessary for that organism. So just be aware that energy starts off at the top from the producers and then works its way through the food chain, and that's the process that's going to take place. And that is going to be extremely important for our ecosystem, for our biome, for our biosphere. The next abiotic component, that happens to be climate. Now, as I said, we are going to be looking at what climate is. Well, here it is. Climate. What makes up a climate? Well, it's the temperature, the humidity, the wind, the precipitation, the atmospheric pressure that exists in a specific area. Now, that all is going to influence what things can actually exist there based upon what conditions they can exist with. So first, we looked at the first abiotic component was energy. So the amount of energy that's present in an ecosystem, biome, biosphere, that's going to be extremely important. Next is a specific climate that's there. So whatever temperature is going to be there, how much precipitation, how much rainfall exists, how much snow exists, whatever that is, the humidity, the different conditions of the weather, that's going to be our climate. So the culmination of all of those conditions, that is going to be what makes up the climate of a specific area. And that's going to determine what organisms can actually exist in that specific location. As well as the third main abiotic component, which is going to be nutrients, the resources that are required for an organism to survive, for an organism to be able to grow, develop, and reproduce. That is going to be what nutrients are for. So we typically look at them at their elemental nature. We look at them as the organisms need carbon, the organisms need hydrogen, the organisms need nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, because they need to make the basic building blocks of all of life: carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and amino acids. So because they need to make those things, they need the building blocks for those different molecules. So very simply, in conclusion, okay, the environmental components come in two different types: abiotic, non-living, and biotic, living. And when we are looking at the environment, we are going to look at it based upon different levels, whether it's the biosphere or the biome or an ecosystem, or moving just into the biotic realm with a community, population, or an organism. So we're going to be studying, when we're going through ecology, we're going to be looking at the world, the biosphere, and we're going to zoom into biomes, and we're going to look at different ecosystems within those biomes, and then moving into communities and populations, and then lastly, just a simple organism that's there. So we're going to look at it at all of those different levels. That is how we study the environment. That's what ecology is all about. Both the living, the biotic, and the non-living, the abiotic. That's it for this time. Be awesome. Stay awesome.